All right, I think maybe we will begin. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to this event. My name is Michael Berry. I am director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. And this is the kickoff of our fall series of online events. I want to begin by thanking Assistant Director of the Center for Chinese Studies, Esther Zhou, for all of the hard work she does behind the scenes to make these events happen. I want to thank all of the members of our campus community who have supported these events. And in particular, this event is unique as it's part of a series sponsored by the Taiwan Academy and the Taiwan Ministry of Culture. And special thanks to those organizations for helping to facilitate this and make it happen. So thank you, Taiwan Academy. This series is one of 8 lectures. We had 4 last year in the spring, and we have 4 this fall, and this is the first of the second half. And coming up, if you check the Center for Chinese Studies website, you will see the upcoming events. We will have the notable writer Wu Mingyi, who I believe will be partially the subject of today's talk. Wu Mingyi and his translator Daryl Stirk will be speaking on Monday. Later on in the middle of the month, Professor Long Yingtai will engage in a dialogue, and we will cap it off with a 4th and final lecture by Professor John Balcom, a specialist in translating Taiwan fiction and Chinese language fiction into English. So please look at our website online, Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, to get information on other upcoming events, as well as our Sammy Lee lecture series, which will happen in November. It's my great honor to welcome our speaker today. This is truly someone who needs no introduction, really one of the giants in the field of contemporary Chinese literary studies, cultural studies, Professor Der-wei Wang from Harvard University. He is the Edward Henderson Professor of Chinese Literature and Comparative Literature. He also holds several other titles. He is director of the CCK Foundation for Inter-University Sinological Studies, and he is also a member of Academia Sinica in Taiwan. He is the author of so many influential studies in the field. Just listing the titles, I think, would take probably the whole time of our lecture series. But just some of the highlights include The Lyrical and Epic Time, The Monster That Is History, Fin de Siècle Splendor, Why Fiction Matters in Contemporary China, Fictional Realism in 20th Century China. That's just a handful of his English language monographs. And there is an equally long and impressive list of Chinese language monographs. And collectively, these are works that have really single-handedly shaped and reshaped the field and the state of the field of Chinese literary studies over the last 25 years or so. And I also want to highlight one of his more recent editorial contributions, this massive book, A New Literary History of Modern China, nearly 1,000 pages, a work that was carried out over many years, and really one of the most constructive and important contributions to rethinking how we look at literary history in 20th century China. Another contribution of David's that I think a lot of people don't talk about as much is his curation and his editorial contributions. Besides all of the articles and lectures and books and monographs that he has published, he is also the editor of numerous book series. At Columbia University Press, he is the editor of Global Chinese Culture and Modern Chinese Literature from Taiwan. In Taiwan at Ryefield, there is a collection of modern masters or contemporary classics. These are all book series that have also had a tremendous impact on reshaping not only the critical field, but actually primary texts and the works of so many important writers. And so I could go on and on with the accolades about Professor Wang, but I'm just so happy he has agreed to join us today for this lecture. And it is, I believe, based off his most recent monograph, which is Why Fiction Matters in Contemporary China, which is more focused on the PRC, but today he's going to give a kind of alternative version of that in the case of Taiwan. And so without further ado, please join me in with a virtual applause for Professor Der-wei Wang.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much for your introduction. I don't think I really deserve those fancy words you used to describe my work. And of course, I want to thank Esther for coordinating this lecture. Definitely, this is a great pleasure and honor for me to be online here at UCLA. I wanted to thank all viewers online to join us in discovering the most recent development of Taiwan fiction. Now let me just turn to share screen so that we can start with some pictures, and then I will just develop my story about contemporary Taiwan literature. Okay, the title, as Professor Barry has already indicated, Tell the Good Taiwan Story, is partially inspired by my recent book, that is Why Fiction Matters in Contemporary China. And this is a book which was published late fall last year. In this book, I primarily tackled the most recent development in both discourse and in practice of the genre fiction. But of course, by fiction, I mean more than just traditional narrative in print. By fiction, I also mean the most recent media inventions and the novelties in terms of internet literature, computer game, and all sorts of digital development, which it revolves this whole practice of storytelling. And I was honestly inspired by President Xi Jinping's famous decree in 2013, 讲好中国故事，传播好中国声音, tell the good China story, disseminate the good China voice. I was inspired by this statement or decree, so much so that I wanted to write something in response to his expectation that all Chinese readers and writers working together to develop a quote unquote good China story. And of course, we know that for President Xi Jinping, telling story or storytelling is not just merely a format of entertainment, of a pastime. Basically, tell the good story is truly a kind of a form of a political persuasion, a kind of demand, if you will, to talk about the ideological dimension of such a kind of presidential statement. Such kind of the statement has to do with nation and the narration, and it definitely involves the functions and the consequences of a narrativity and a governance. Involved in such a kind of exercise of telling the good China story are issues of readership and censorship, are issues related to creativity and a kind of sort of a self-regulation. So a lot of things could be elicited from such a kind of engagement with the form of a fiction. And we all know that a narrative fiction or 小说 was developed as early as the turn of the 20th century, to be very specific, in 1902, by reformers such as Liang Qichao as the most powerful vehicle to rejuvenate China. So how come storytelling on the one hand, nation building on the other hand, could be brought together to bear upon this whole project of Chinese political and cultural modernity? I think that's something we all want to think hard about. My question for today's lecture, however, is directed into somewhat different dimension. That is, when we have listened to so many wonderful good China stories told by various writers, by various forms of information organs. What about Taiwan's response? And I just wanted to argue that what would be the Taiwan version of tell the good Taiwan story? And of course, by asking this question, I'm already having some kind of different answers in my mind. For one thing, do we have to tell the good Taiwan story, singular form, or we actually have more than one good Taiwan stories to tell? So that probably already points to a very different format of engaging with this time-honored genre in the society of Taiwan. We have heard multiple voices from all directions, each relating its own kind of a take on the ups and downs of Taiwan history, its blindness and insight regarding Taiwan society and the human conditions in Taiwan in general. But above all, what does this key word good mean in the Taiwan context? When we were told in the Chinese context, tell the good China story, this particular magic word, good, actually sounds somewhat demanding, somewhat mandatory, right? You better tell a good story, otherwise you wait and see. We all have to tell the good story. But in the Taiwan context, I wanted to suggest something more paradoxical. That is, we do want to tell good Taiwan stories, but sometimes we are also capable of telling not so good Taiwan stories. In other words, we are actually approaching the overall conditions in Taiwan from multiple perspectives. And we end up giving multiple evaluations in the narrative form. So I think what I wanted to do is a very kind of a dialogic kind of engagement with the situation in Taiwan. And I wanted to argue that stories told from the Taiwan perspective can be extremely inspiring, not only in the sphere of Sinophone literature and the Chinese literature, and Taiwan stories could also be equally inspiring in the sphere of world literature. So here, I don't want to belabor what I have said. This page sort of summarize what I wanted to define in terms of fiction and fiction in China and fiction in Taiwan and so on and so forth. Instead, I wanted to give or share with everybody some recent examples as to the prosperity of the whole industry of storytelling. Again, not just in the format of print or printed narrative, but also in many other forms of mediation. I am not sure if viewers online today have read about or even watched the most popular TV soap opera series, which just ended a broadcast a few weeks ago in Taiwan. The title, 斯卡罗, right? And this is a kind of odd sounding or exotic sounding title for a TV soap opera, but actually it couldn't be more indigenous because this particular invocation, 斯卡罗, refers to one specific Aboriginal tribal community in Taiwan, referring to a particularly a very, very legendary encounter between Taiwanese Aborigines, Han settlers, and American expedition. In the interest of the time, I'm not going to give or reveal too much of the plot of this TV soap opera. Just primarily, I just want to share with everybody the basic. That is, this soap opera deals with the Rover incident, which took place in the year 1867, when an American merchant ship, Rover, was wrecked off the coast of southern Taiwan. 14 American sailors on board, including the captain and his wife, were killed by the revenge of the local Aborigines of this area, southern Taiwan. This became a political event. It becomes the beginning of the diplomatic encounter between Taiwan and America. So two major characters in this event. On the one hand, a Taiwan chieftain, Zhuo Jidu, and on the other hand, an American envoy based in Amoy, Li Xiande, Charles Legendre, they had some really very, very intriguing encounters revolving this incident, the rover incident. The result, well, an MOU of the so-called South Cape Nanjia Zhimeng. And so this particular incident had been obscured for many years, but now, thanks to the novel by a actually physician named Chen Yaochang, all of a sudden it became an extremely fascinating sort of a legendary event involving a Taiwan-American relationship. In the original, the title of the novel is 傀儡花, puppet flower, referring particularly to the heroine of this novel. But now, in the TV soap opera edition, this is a 斯卡罗, right? And according to Dr. Chen, this is a Taiwan 史小说, 它的花系列. So we could expect that he will soon have a series of novels with the invocation of a flower, whatever, in the titles. Anyway, very, very ambitious writer who wanted to recover the long lost the historical episodes in the semi-colonial or colonial experience of Taiwan, according to Dr. Chen, dating way back to the 17th or even 16th century. Right? And I believe Professor Michael Barry was also involved in the translation of this novel, Puppet Flower, which would eventually be published by Columbia University Press, probably next year. All I wanted to say that is a TV soap opera such as 斯卡罗, which really sort of excited the audience in Taiwan. People just couldn't talk enough about the multiple dimensions of the presentation of this incident. And some people wanted to say this is really a kind of kind of a national allegory involving Taiwan and America, this first diplomatic encounter, and hopefully the project in the long run, the relationship between Taiwan and America, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to say that 斯卡罗 is only one of the recent novelistic attempts to engage with Aboriginal or truly indigenous memories of the actually very traumatic encounter between the local and the newcomers, particularly the colonial forces. We probably still remember a few years ago, 赛德克巴莱. This is a really popular sort of an epic film directed by Wei Sheng, based upon the Musha incident that happened in late 1930, arguably one of the most brutal incidents in resistance to Japanese colonial force during the colonial history of Japan over Taiwan. And again, this film was inspired by fiction. And the title of this novel, 余生, in English, Remains of Life, which was beautifully translated by Professor Michael Barry. The author of 余生 is Wu He. So just like Dr. Chen Yaochang, Wu He is also a Han Chinese writer. Nevertheless, he was very curious about the obscure dimension of Taiwan colonial memories, and he wanted to do his own sort of exploration, and he ended up telling a story which is very, very different from the mainstream discourse about the Aboriginal insurrection against the Japanese at this time. All I want to say is that if you take a look at Puppet Flower, in comparison and contrast with Remains of Life, you actually can tell that the storyline has been actually modified or changed. I mean, more or less echoing the current ethos of implied readers in Taiwan. In Remains of Life, this is really a very melancholy, sad, pensive sort of a novel, thinking of the causes of and the consequences of the Musha incident, very, very bloody and brutal. And Wu He actually ended it by projecting a very sort of critical perspective from which to understand that part of Taiwan history, Han Chinese, Aboriginals, and even colonizers, the Japan forces. In Chen Yaochang's novel, you actually have something very different from the author first, and then from the script team, the playwrights, who really wanted to forge this 1867 incident into a kind of integral part in anticipation of the eventual development of the sovereignty of Taiwan. So there is a kind of implied political line in Puppet Flower, in sharp contrast with Remains of Alive, which is basically a very melancholic reflection upon the fate of Aborigines in the aftermath of the Musha incident. But no matter what, I just wanted to say that these kind of novels can be very, very suggestive in terms of our understanding of how we want to tell and retell Taiwan stories with quotation marks. And on that note, I wanted to add one name, that is the Dawu, another Aboriginal writer, Shamalan, who in 2018 published a most recent kind of fictional reportage about his own roots. He's from Lanyu, as you could see from the screen. It's a tiny island southeast of main island of Taiwan. And Shamalan all along has been writing to really to try to assert his own Aboriginal Dawu identity in differentiation from the Han identity, which is currently endorsed by both the governmental authorities and by general public, probably primarily on the mainland. Instead, Shamalan wanted to argue that his hometown or his home region cannot be traced to any kind of a Han-related history or civilization. So in his most recent work, 大海之眼, The Eye of the Sea, he actually ventured to argue that he's a descendant of the Austronesian settlers on this tiny island, Lanyu, and to really engage in a root search or root seeking investigation. He should not go back to Taiwan or anywhere like that. Instead, he should go to the South Pacific. Purportedly, his ancestors from the sea. He ended up, of course, going to a tiny place, the Rarotonga Island of the Cook Islands. You can tell from this map where the red arrow is pointed at. It's a very, very tiny island where Shaman felt this is where his hometown could really be identified, the very originary place where his ancestors came from. And in other words, in using Han Chinese language, Shaman Lambuan actually meant to tell a very different national or tribal story. That is, he doesn't believe he is even a Taiwanese. So how do we incorporate such a kind of a discourse into our understanding of Tell the Good Taiwan Story? Are we still going to demand some writer like Xiaman to claim, to pledge his adherence to the current mainstream Taiwan discourse? I think that remains to be questioned, and definitely Xiaman, I think, is truly brave and bold enough to remind us of the multiple beginnings of the so-called the origins of the Taiwan story or Taiwan history. And now, with these examples in mind, I'm going now to quickly go over theoretical dimensions we probably could make association with the whole Tell the Good China Story part. Here we probably can think of Hannah Arendt. We can think about her theory about storytelling and sociality. We may think about Mikhail Bakhtin, the concept of heteroglossia. We can also think about Walter Benjamin, the storyteller, and so on and so forth. I mean, the list can go on endlessly in terms of storytelling and the community building in multiple Western perspectives. On the China side, of course, Liang Qichao's famous 1902 manifesto on the relationships between fiction and politics, arguably the first article which inaugurated the discourse about nation and narration, and a tradition which is being endorsed still by President Xi Jinping in China, and very, very ironic, probably also is being endorsed by political leaders in Taiwan and the sort of intellectuals in general in Taiwan. But what I really want to suggest is that if we could go even further back to the pre-modern part of the theory regarding history and the storytelling, perhaps Feng Menglong's argument or statement where history falls apart, fiction arises. Probably that also makes sense to us in our review of multiple perspectives of understanding the relationship between storytelling or narrativity and either dynastic sovereignty or nation building. But no matter what, these theories can be put aside for a while. I think our main purpose for today is to think about how good Taiwan stories could be told or are being told by writers in Taiwan. So in the following, I'm going to introduce a series of most recent works by writers in Taiwan. For example, Huang Chongkai, a young writer from Tainan, he published a novel, New Formosa, this past May. And this is a kind of a semi-science fiction because in this novel, Huang Chongkai described that on the next presidential inauguration day, that is May 20th, 2024, there would be something really amazing happening the day after. Because after the new president takes the office, this new president hasn't happened to be an Aboriginal. People in Taiwan actually wake up the second morning, realize that they have been miraculously relocated to an island, which is none other than Cuba. And in the same time, the residents in Cuba wake up on the morning of May 21st, realizing now that they are actually living on the island called Taiwan. So the whole fantastic sort of incredible transplantation leads us to one incredible episode to another. So this is how Huang Chongkai is imagining the two otherwise irrelevant sort of ideological, political, and societal communities now through this magical sort of swap. And now new political chemistry now suddenly spark new kind of a thinking of the future of the world. So this is a kind of a fantastic novel, which actually well, in a way, probably unnerve some of the readers in Taiwan, or I don't know whether there may be readers in Cuba also feel kind of a weird or odd. But what Huang Zhongkai really means to suggest is that this is how fiction can really demonstrate its power, that through imagination, through fabulation, the future of Taiwan could be programmed into different kind of narratives, inciting new rounds of discussion and debate. In a similar vein, the very popular novelist in Taiwan, Lu Yijun, in 2019, 2 years ago, published his Ming Chao, the Ming Dynasty, or if you are familiar with the Chinese pun, Ming Chao also refers to the day after Ming Tian or Ming Zhao, right? And this is a novel about the demise of the Ming Dynasty at its most glamorous and most decadent. And Lu Yijun imagined that some kind of a database could be invented, and some kind of cyberspace could be created in such a way as to transfer all the wonderful memories and achievements of the Ming Dynasty into another space, outer space, the third galaxy or whatever. Therefore, this historical saga ushers us into the futuristic odyssey of a kind of scientific fantasy. Many critics in Taiwan have attacked this novel for being a kind of a defeatist kind of allegory with regard to the fate of Taiwan. But I think that this is the license a novelist can take. And I mean, if we can think of the brightest future of Taiwan, we can equally imagine the darkest possibility of Taiwan. And Lu Yijun here, of course, is imagining that the great civilization here, the code name is the Ming Dynasty, right? Has been through all the wonderful ups and downs, and now it is ready to be thrown into the third space or the fourth space, awaiting yet another round of reincarnation. All right, so that's Lu Yijun's project. And again, I just want to push my sort of a mini genealogy a little bit further to suggest that a novel for Formosa Heat, 2017, by a Taiwan writer named Lin Junyi, Meng Shu. Also, in this novel, Mr. Lin was imagining the day after, but this time the day after happened nowhere but in Taiwan. After Taiwan had already been occupied by some unknown force, what would be the next day? And to everybody's amazement, nothing would happen. Life would be just moving on as usual. And in a very sort of toned down the mood of a fatigue, blasé, or whatever you want to say, people in Taiwan seems to be quickly adapting to this new circumstances and live a life as usual. But everybody knows this is no longer the same Taiwan life we are all familiar with. So this is, again, a highly polemical novel. It has a very critical part of Taiwan politics as we are witnessing at this moment. But on the other hand, this is also a sober and even sobering novel about the multiple dimensions of the fate of Taiwan one can think of. So a lot of political engagement can actually be solicited from our reading of fiction. And sometimes I would even say that all these political arguments, like it or not, are much more sophisticated than TV talk show hosts or politicians' talks, right? And here, really, I think that the fiction as a genre and as a kind of a narrative sequence drives us into a different kind of domain in which we can more seriously engage with the possibilities and the impossibilities of Taiwan in future. On the other hand, writers such as Yang Shuangzi, she is extremely popular right now for her actually sort of a kind of a lighthearted take on Taiwan history. And in this passage of to Taiwan, a novel which was published the last year, Yang Shuangzi just sort of invited us to join a kind of incredible sort of trip through the tunnel of time back to the 1910s and 1920s, the colonial period. And there, she described a kind of sort of effective encounter between a young Japanese woman and a young Taiwanese woman, or two girls, if you will. There are some kind of unspeakable sort of emotional reverberations between these two female characters. In the meanwhile, another side, on the other side of the Taiwan experience, particularly the experience of a Taiwan cuisine, the experience of the food of Taiwan was being very, very vividly described. In other words, Yang Shuangzi seems to be suggesting that the grand master narrative aside, perhaps we can take a quote unquote, a lighthearted, relatively speaking, a lighthearted approach to the feminine sort of experience of Taiwan history. And as the story goes on, we come to realize that this so-called lighthearted history could be just as dark and dismal as the grand narrative. So I think this is a very, very imaginative account of the colonial experience of Taiwan. And the Yang Shuangzi obviously is winning a lot of readers' attention, not just the mainstream readers, but also readers in the tradition of pop fiction. Recently, beyond this approach to the national past or the societal past of Taiwan, writers such as Gan Yaoming, certainly he is a very famous name among literature lovers in Taiwan. He has just recently published a novel, Chongli Chen的人, Ming Dynasty. This is a Bunong tribal dialect in translation. 2021 novel about a tragic incident that happened on September 10th, 1945, 三叉山事件, an American military airplane crash right after the end of the war. Somehow Japanese and Taiwanese policemen organized a kind of rescue team travels days and night to this mountainous area in southern Taiwan, trying to rescue the people who may have survived the crash. The result, of course, is a really disastrous findings. This is a devastating crash, but worse than that, when the rescue team was about to leave the site of the crash, they ran into a huge typhoon, and as a result, the whole team of the rescuers died from the typhoon, except for one person. So this novel involves American, Japanese, Taiwanese, and Aboriginal communities, sort of right at the very sensitive moment of the post Second World War experience. And also it involves a very, very touching story between two young boys affair, two Aboriginal young boys affair in the mountain town Hualien. So I think this, again, a highly imaginative approach to a historical incident in Taiwan. And I thought this kind of a novel, this kind of a style definitely is to be encouraged. Personally, I was definitely very, very moved by the style of Mr. Gan Yaoming's storytelling. I mean, at the other end of the wide spectrum of telling the good Taiwan stories, we also run into a storyteller such as Igor Yen. science fiction, 0 degree of a separation, which is really something one wouldn't have expected of Taiwan writers, primarily in light of the boom of science fiction in the PRC. One wonders if Taiwan writers could have had any different kind of take on this whole genre. The result, of course, is Igor Yen's very inventive collection of stories, a 0 degree of separation, which I personally welcome. And certainly I thought this is a kind of type of stories which may win a broader readers market worldwide. And of we understand Wu Mingyi, who arguably is the most popular writer in Taiwan at this moment, The Land of Little Rain, which came out in 2019. For me, I have to confess, this is my personal favorite. This is, again, a kind of collection of novellas and short stories touching upon multiple dimensions of the Taiwan experience. You can say this is a kind of a collection about ecology, environmentalism. It is about nativist or indigenous experience. It is it's a science fiction too. And above all, one powerful story after another. And at the heart of the storytelling is the fundamental question about the proximity of people's relationships. Chinese or non-Chinese, Taiwanese or Chinese, foreigners or even aliens. How do we approximate this terms of intimacy and the alienation? I think Wu Mingyi is a profound writer, and I'm very pleased to know that he will be appearing in the same series in just a few weeks. I think the latest one is probably the most ambitious one so far in his experience as a writer. I wanted to conclude my talk with some kind of a self-promotion through a series of publications from Columbia University Press. As Professor Barry indicated just now, for years I've been editor of a series titled "The Chinese Literature from Taiwan," and I think the series has been going strong, and we have published quite a number of wonderful novels and even poetry collections by writers based in Taiwan or writers writing about Taiwan. So just this year and the last year, Columbia Press has published Luo Yijun. We have introduced him just now, Far Away. And this is a kind of a semi-biographical novel about Luo Yijun and his father, who is a mainlander emigrant to Taiwan after 1949, about a family reunion and also about the impossibility of a family reunion. And Der-wei Wang, Membranes, this is a famous and a popular queer novelist from Taiwan. And I'm very pleased to recommend this collection of novellas, which now is available in English. If you are curious about how far a Taiwan sci-fi writer could go with all the issues that may concern you or intrigue you, from cyborgian experience to queer adventures and so on and so forth, I think this is the collection of stories that you don't want to miss. And above all, more to come. I mean, in just a few months, we will publish The Elephant Herd, a Taiwanese Malaysian writer, Zhang Guixing, his novel about the experience in Borneo, the rainforest, all the exotic things and so on and so forth. At the core, of course, is a kind of a dark story about Chinese Malaysian leftist activities in the jungle. Zhang Guixing, particularly known for his beautiful language, and this is something we are proud of featuring. And finally, Puppet Flower, Escalo. I think this novel, this is a traditional kind of historical saga. And Chen Yaochang is a good storyteller, a more traditional type of a storyteller. Now, thanks to Professor Barry's magic touch, the narrative now has become more appealing than ever. So I hope next year, when this novel is available in English, readers in the English-speaking world could also enjoy this novel and understand one of those untold stories about the early part of Taiwan colonial history. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang, for such a rich overview of so much of the changes that have happened in the Taiwan literary scene over the last 10 years or so. For the format, David and I will engage in a short dialogue. I have a few questions, and then we're going to start opening it up to the audience. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I would love to prioritize undergrad students, graduate students. So if you're a student, no question is too naive or there's no bad question, just put it out there. And so we'll try to get to some student questions first and then move on to general attendees. So please do utilize the Q&A box. I want to begin back to the good story. And that's where David began his talk about what is the good China story. And he began with the PRC context. And in the PRC context, there really hasn't been that great of a change in terms of defining what is the good story. In some sense, Xi Jinping's current policy about telling the good China story is more than anything else a return to the good old days of the Yan'an talks on art and literature, and it's reinforcing those same kind of good old socialist principles that literature should serve the party and should have a pedagogical impetus. It should engage, a mass amount of readers and tell the positive energy story, the zheng nengliang kind of side of things. And so earlier, David mentioned this question about whether the story in Taiwan was, whether it was a singular or a plurality, and whether there were multiple ways to tell the story. I think right now in China, it's pretty clear. And also in the Taiwan context, it's also pretty clear just how vibrant that plurality is. But what I would like to begin with is bringing the clock back a little bit to the good old days in Taiwan. What I mean by that is in Laojiang Shidai, the age of Chiang Kai-shek, during the Cold War period. I think in some sense, that's a much closer parallel to when we think of the good China story and the political context of that. That White Terror and Cold War period is much closer in terms of a parallel. And so I want to begin by asking, was there a good China story? We could say Taiwan story, but at that point, Taiwan identified itself as China. What was the good China/Taiwan story in Taiwan during the Cold War period, and how did writers navigate the political imperative at that time? We all know about the nativists and the modernists and the literary kind of conflicts that were going on and disagreements over the role of literature. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what was the good story during that era?
Thank you very much, Michael. I think in the 1950s, of course, the KMT government was trying hard to formulate its own version of a good China story and the 反共抗俄小说, anti-communist fiction, and so on and so forth. But of course, the overall production of a novelistic discourse is couched in this whole propaganda campaign, right? So basically, there was definitely a very strict guideline as to how you can tell your good story. But in the meantime, I just wanted to suggest that there are writers, even during those days of the White Terror, who wrote in such a way as to deviate from the projected track programmed by the party or by the particular propaganda organ. And for example, I've written extensively about fiction by a mainland immigrant writer, Jiang Gui, Double Sons, and so on and so forth. And you will find that he actually meant to tell more than what would otherwise have been described as a good formula of China's story, right? And usually it's from this kind of stories you come to realize the tension and the subtleties, right, of writers writing in Taiwan in opposition to the government. But also, I want to argue very ironically, thanks to a relatively lax machine of a censorship and surveillance. Right? I mean, above all, the KMT was not as apt and sufficient as the PRC, or CCP, in monitoring the writing, the reading of literature at the time. Writers were able to find niches or channels through which to utter their own kind of voices. Things became even clearer in the 1960s when modernism became the unexpected leeway in terms of a creative form for the younger generation of writers. So midway through 1960s, already you could read the fiction, which should we say, which was competent and ambiguous enough to really point to the unspoken part of the story of Taiwan. I'm thinking of the early stories by women writers such as Liang and Shi Shuqing. And of course, we can think of Bai Xianyong, his work through the 1960s, culminating in the collection Taipei People in Taipei, and so on and so forth. Also, we are thinking of writers such as Chen Yijun, leftist writer, who wrote in Taiwan and who was able to publish thanks to, should we use the word, thanks to the negligence or the stupidity of the surveillance system. So even then, I thought in the 60s, I thought definitely you see varieties and the vitality among Taiwan writers, if we want to think of the situation, the counterpart in China, which definitely was getting more and more severe. Of course, was the first climax coming in 1966, when all creative writings suddenly came to a halt as a result of the Great Cultural Revolution.
Thank you. And then if we move things forward to 1987, when the lifting of martial law happens, and all of a sudden we have this real renaissance of new voices on what you characterize here. And in one of your own older books was a heteroglacia, right? Zhongsheng Shenhua, and all of these divergent perspectives. And in some sense, almost a factionalization of different literary camps that we start seeing. And I'm wondering, right now, with so many divergent voices and also with such radical different political changes that have happened in Taiwan over the last 20 years. I mean, every 4 years, politically, there's a flip-flop, and all of a sudden you have large percentages of the population aligning or realigning themselves with different parties and different camps. And I'm wondering how that kind of a very unstable political climate has impacted writers and readers. And do we see kind of a factionalization among and different readerships growing, bubbling up? And maybe if you could tie some of these different writers that we've seen to the different political trends and social changes that have happened, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that kind of factionalization and how it impacts readers.
Yeah, this is a very, very intriguing question. I mean, this is something I really should think hard before offering a good answer. But in the interest of the time, let me just try. And indeed, after 1987, Taiwan literature experienced a boom in terms of subject matters. All of a sudden, all the so-called forbidden topics or subjects suddenly became available for writer to write about, to think about, and to talk about. And definitely the 1990s witnessed truly a dynamic scene of writing about the past, about the present of Taiwan. And as you pointed out, the different kind of factions arose to testify to the volatile nature of writing and the reading literature. Coming to mind, of course, again, the woman writers such as Liang, who now was coming forward to really unveil really the raw scenes of political struggles in relation to her favorite subject matter of sexuality. So definitely you see this kind of bold intervention with the forbidden topics. On the other hand, of course, women writers such as Zhu Tianwen, who was experimenting with gay fiction, or her sister, Zhu Tianxin, who was writing something along the line of nostalgia for the lost golden days of the KMT rule, or even a kind of a Taiwanese version of a root-seeking sort of an effort in relation to the long-lost mainland China, and so on and so forth. I wanted to say that on that note, the appearance of a novel such as Remains of a Life in the year 2000 really marked a turning point. I mean, Wu He is a very, very good writer in the sense of being able to look into provocative subject matters, but presenting those matters in a truly sort of a well-programmed in a non-provocative manner. So he didn't write just to draw readers or fans immediate applause or whatsoever. Instead, he really took us into the sort of the darker depth of shared memories of Taiwan and so on and so forth. So I think after the first decade, the last decade of the 20th century, Taiwan fiction was becoming I would say more subtle in terms of engaging with political issues and historical issues at large. Then in the meantime, we have to be realistic about the media boom, which took the majority readers' attention from the traditional book market to the new arena of internet culture, digital games, and of course, films and TV soap operas and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in general, literature suffered from a setback in the turn of the new millennium. I wanted to argue in a very ironic way that this kind of a setback actually provided some kind of unexpected sort of opportunity for writers who really wanted to engage with unpopular topics. You didn't just write to win some kind of market shares anymore. You know you are not going to become bestseller anyway, right? And you know that your readers will be probably sometimes just handful. So writers actually are coming down, and they are looking around to really dig out hitherto discovered or less discovered topics and so on. In the meantime, I think you seem to point out the very intriguing phenomenon that is factionalism, however, is surging up. I mean, although we have really a smaller and a smaller readership to speak of, our readers now are really determined to take sides when it comes to their favorite writers, political or ideological or gender or historical identity or profile, right? So it's very, very interesting that now the internet world dominated the whole sort of the discourse regarding what is fiction or what makes up good fiction and so on and so forth. I mean, the best case for us to think of is Luo Yijun, right? In the 1990s, he was extremely popular for his kind of a fantastic but eerie imagination of life in Taiwan at its most decadent and intricate, almost a kind of an inextricable kind of a portrayal of kind of a kaleidoscopic facets of Taiwan, anything you can imagine, right? Or you cannot imagine, would actually end up being portrayed by Yijun in his fiction. He continuously won a lot of attention after the new millennium, but he became more and more controversial because of his political adherence or affiliation. And things evolved to become a kind of uncontrollable, kind of a melodramatic situation. And the fans pointed the fingers at each other and so on and so forth. And so in that sense, factionalism may very well be factionalism in the political arena, right? So I don't know how to judge this kind of fight over a certain novel or a certain novelist's the position. So maybe it's a good thing. I mean, maybe it still indicates that fiction matters for at least for some readers and the critics. In the meantime, what really interests me, as you suggested, that is the wavering, the subtle sort of shifting in terms of political grounds or literary taste of readers and the critics. I mean, in the midst of all this kind of exchange of words and attacks and over a certain phenomenon, and sometimes it's a very journalistically or topically relevant. Sometimes it really has matter to do with the style of a certain writer. All I wanted to say is that fiction, if we are talking about the traditional format of a novel in print, is not a big major phenomenon in terms of overall media consumption. But still, the stories are being told not only in the sense that a certain writer writes about some kind of story. The stories are actually spilled all over, right? Not only about fiction as such, but also about the ecology of writing and reading and consuming fiction. And it's also about the IP right, sort of an extension of the traditional format of novelistic creation. I mean, the most immediate case, that's the case I used for today's discussion, Chen Yaochang's case. This is a retired physician from National Taiwan University Hospital. It's about 10, 12 years ago, he suddenly wanted to write fiction. I wouldn't say that he's first-rate fiction writer, but somehow he managed to dig out interesting materials and fabulated all his materials into a very, very intriguing narrative sequence, a full-length historical saga, and so on and so forth. Reading his novel, you will feel this is a good old guy who is eager to share with you his findings and discoveries of early Taiwan history, traditional kind of a novelistic saga. But then the TV adaptation recently became so controversial, primarily because the playwrights, the script writers, took up the original and to change and tweak the plots and the characters and the moments in such a way as to fit into new discourse. And I'm afraid to say this new discourse is sort of mandated by governmental authorities. It's more politically correct than the more obscure and ambiguous tone as projected by the original. That's where you could see that telling the good Taiwan story is still a tug of a war, right? Between those who have resources, the powers, and the capitals, and those who really want to tell good stories in relation to the very complicated origins of Taiwan experience.
Thank you. We do have some questions coming in, and we're going to be going to those soon. So again, if you have questions, place them in the Q&A, but I've got one or two more for Professor Wang, if he doesn't mind, before we turn it over. And I want to pick up, we mentioned this issue of factionalism just a moment ago. And of course, when you think about literary factions or literary groups in Taiwan, the most prevalent example would be during the 1960s and 70s when you had the nativists and the modernists. And as we move into the post-87 period, this kind of drops out. We don't really have groups. You don't have writers. So, I mean, there in the 80s, there was the Zhutianwen Sansan group for a little while. But after martial law was lifted, that really dissipates and it becomes a kind of free-for-all where everybody has their own voice. However, during the last 5 years, one of the most interesting developments in the contemporary Taiwan literary scene that I've observed actually involves several of the writers you talked about today. And they formed a collective called the Zimuhui, the Alphabet Society. And it's the first time in decades that I think we've seen a collective movement among middle-aged and younger writers to kind of tell a story. And I thought you might bring this up as an example, because when we think of telling a story, here is a group of about a dozen writers who literally wrote a collective literary dictionary. And if there isn't something more prescriptive than that, I don't know what is. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the emergence of this new collective and what it says about your topic today.
I could have talked about Zimuhui, except that I personally, I feel sorry. I personally feel this is a failed attempt. This is a kind of sort of collective initiated by a scholar named Yang Kailing, a scholar I personally very respect, and in French, contemporary French philosophy, he's really a kind of a highbrow intellectual trying to engage with literary manifestation of his own thoughts and the beliefs. So he summoned or organized a group of very fine writers, as you said. Some are very, very veteran experience, Yijun, Chen Yaochang, and so on and so forth, and some much younger. And the mission is Zimu, the alphabet, right, from A to Z. And so Professor Yang invoked the ABCD, all the alphabets, and assign I would say each session, probably a 3-month cycle, to a group of writers to write something. For example, A for apple, or B for boulevard, or whatever, something probably more sophisticated than my examples. But anyway, so it involves some kind of sort of a subtle competition among these writers involved in this collective writing about the same keyword, trying to develop different kind of stories about that particular keyword. I would say this is a great idea, and Professor Yang and his friends all try very hard, but I'm afraid to say that time has changed. And you mentioned the factor of factionalism, either within the literary circle in terms of aesthetic judgment, or in terms of a political agenda, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, of course, the whole industry, the cultural industry, revolving now digital world, and there's all this kind of a new capitals involved in the making of a new kind of a world of communication. I think the new things much affected the development of the Zimuhui project. The result is a very fine, I still would say very fine, because I have at least thumbed through the 26 volumes based upon the 26 alphabets or keywords. And I admire those writers' dedication to this project. But personally, still, I would feel this is a very elite experiment. And it's very neat. If it were happening in the 1960s or 70s, it would have been probably a huge success. But this time, I suspect if enough readers have paid attention to the efforts as invested by writers of this Zimuhui.
Thank you. So I could keep going, but we have a couple questions waiting. So why don't we turn it over to a couple of our audience questions. And I'm going to begin with a graduate student from UCSB, Linshan Jiang, Jiang Linshan. Dear Professor Wang, do you see a gender dimension in the recent development of writers writing historical novels and sagas?
Okay, I actually can answer this question in two ways. Probably, Michael, you understand my take on a puppet flower, and I can share with this story with everybody here, because to begin with, the English title of a puppet flower, or Sika was Princess Butterfly. When I first looked at the title, I was quite amazed by the not so wonderful association, right, between butterfly, Princess Butterfly, and the Madama Butterfly. Now, obviously, our writer and his first translator were thinking of taking advantage of this, what do we call it now, kind of Orientalist gender fantasy, right? And then, sure enough, there is a beautiful girl, half Hakka and half Aboriginal, beautiful translator, right? Who ended up sort of being not really seduced or coerced into. I mean, the description in the original was romantic and lyrical, right? But from the post-Me Too sort of a perspective, we would say this is a sexual harassment between this American envoy, Le Chant, and this Taiwanese Aboriginal girl. And the writer, however, happily wrote about this affair, right, as a kind of an exotic romance. This is unacceptable, not to me, probably not to you, Michael, not even to the editors at the Columbia University. And again, our reviewers suggested that could we either tone down those explicit sexual erotic description, or should we just offer some kind of a gender perspective from women's point of view, and so on and so forth. So that probably is something we want to think about. And by contrast, Yang Shuangzi, I just introduced this lady writer, apparently really very popular among readers in Taiwan. She has taken a much more sophisticated approach to this gender issue. You probably could easily say from, again, a queer perspective by arguing that Yang Shuangzi is writing to cater to a kind of a newer generation of readers after the passing of the same-sex marriage law in Taiwan, But thankfully, she didn't. She actually wrote a very subtle kind of a relationship between two women characters, one from Japan, from local Taiwan. Really, I think this kind of very nuanced portray of this kind of sentiments back and forth between these two characters through their shared appreciation of Taiwanese food and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, you realize that gender doesn't have to be foregrounded say abruptly or so politically as we see in the 1990s gender fictions, either romantic fiction, or the new sort of a 同志小说, gay fiction, so on and so forth. So agenda oriented. I think the younger generation of writers are really taking a different look at the gender relationship. And they are more ready than before to incorporate this gender situations, circumstances into a much broader societal and historical fabric. I mean, the result is a very neat and nuanced portray of a kind of a sort of emotional cartography of one generation of Taiwanese characters. I'm not sure whether I have answered this question or not, because there are so many other examples I can draw to illustrate my observation. But basically, I just want to express my personal appreciation of the latest turn in terms of gender politics and the novelistic expression.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, I do notice some audience members are raising their hand. We are not taking live questions, so if you have a question, instead of raising your hand, please type it in the Q&A box. So next I'm going to go to two PhD students who have similar questions, both about Taiwan science fiction. So I'm going to try to put these together. One is from Laura Stahl, a PhD student in anthropology, and the other is from Shuwen Yang, who is I believe a MA student here also at UCLA. And they both thank you for the fascinating and insightful talk. And Laura asks, can you please elaborate about what is portrayed as the quote, good Taiwan story in modern Taiwanese science fiction in particular? I'm interested in this subject in relation to the techno-scientific, techno-political present. I would like to hear more about whether you see recurrent themes and explorations of the future in the fiction you have explored. And Shuwen elaborates a little bit more about that and asks about if there's any specific reason that the genre of science fiction is standing out in the contemporary moment. She feels that there's a burst of sci-fi both in mainland China and in Taiwan, and is wondering if there's anything particular about the intersection between science fiction and the quote unquote good story, science fiction and nation building rather than just fiction and nation building.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think these are extremely great and provocative questions for me to think about. Let me just try to answer these questions in a kind of a simplistic way. First, I wanted to thank the first question because it just remind me of the fact that, it should remind everyone of the fact that science fiction didn't just suddenly pop up in Taiwan in the new millennium in response to the PRC boom of science fiction. Instead, actually, science fiction in Taiwan enjoyed a short period of popularity and prosperity in the 70s and 80s in Taiwan. I think I can name at least 3 writers for your reference. We start with Huang Hai. And then we follow that by talking about Ye Yandu and particularly Zhang Xiguo. Right? These were all writers who were already demonstrating their, say, imagination and talent, thinking of not merely of Taiwan in relation to science fiction, but the world in relation to science fiction. Particularly, I think Zhang Xiguo, he has been writing continuously a sort of scientific or scientistic kind of observation in fictional terms of Taiwan versus mainland China, and of course still in a global context, and of course a galactical context. So I think in that sense that these writers, Huang Hai, Ye Yandu, and Zhang Xiguo definitely are forerunners of science fiction, given the current paradigm we are talking about. In the 1990s, science fiction writers seems to become a bit quiet. I mean, just as we were talking about the post-1987 sort of suddenly this kind of boom in terms of subject matters. All of a sudden, somehow science fiction writers became reticent. I mean, in response to this kind of new the plethora of topics, subject matters, and mostly related to the history and memory of Taiwan in the bygone ages. But still, I wanted to say that after the new millennium, science fiction has come back also in Taiwan, probably also more diversified in terms of generic attributes. For example, my question, to what extent can we talk about Luo Yijun as a science fiction writer? In his 2015 novel, Daughter, 女儿, this is a novel about a cyborg, about a robotic, female robotic sort of a character entangled with the familiar life of Luo Yijun's persona in the novel. And Luo Yijun utilized his layman knowledge of 20th century physical science, right, from Einstein's relativism all the way to various scientific discourses, very, very popular through 20th century. So it's really a showmanship, just trying to show off his knowledge of something new and different. Or Luo Yijun wanted to use the motif of science fiction to explore some dimension of Taiwanese conditions that he otherwise couldn't have, right? So this kind of question is something for us to think about. And Wu Mingyi's fiction, I think almost all of his novels have the dimensions of science fiction, from a Man with Compounded Eyes to my favorite, Land of a Little Rain, without any preparation for some kind of a science fiction elements, you wouldn't be able to appreciate his novels, because you feel, gee, I expect to read some good old tearjerker or some kind of historical saga. No, you will be disappointed, because Wu Mingyi really wanted to approach his Taiwan-related topics from either a post-human perspective, or from some kind of a fantastic kind of a perspective. So it's a fun to read and appreciate the way he invent and reinvent Taiwan. And of course, Igor Yen perhaps so far is the most persistent science fiction writer in a classical definition, and no wonder he's winning popularity even in the mainland. His most recent novel, or collection of novellas, has won much critical attention across the Taiwan Straits. And in that sense, I think, maybe there is no dialogue between the two governments across the Straits, but who knows? In the futuristic terms, there is already some conversation between science fiction writers and the readers. I think that's the power of a fiction, right? And the fiction allows you to imagine beyond the immediate horizons of your lived experience, to explore all sorts of topics. And with Igor Yen's latest collection of science fiction, really, I wrote something about this work. I call it a kind of post-human archaeology, right? Of terms of endearment, love, intimacy, sexuality, erotic fantasies, and so forth. And the stories do not necessarily happen only in Taiwan. It could be Siberia, it could be Kyoto, it could be some never land. But somehow this is a Taiwan-based writer's imagination. So I'm very optimistic about this genre in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're getting close to the end. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes left. And I'm wondering if Professor Wang would indulge us. We could have 3 questions left. Maybe if we could do a rapid fire round and maybe try to give fairly succinct answers to these, but I do want to try to get to all of those questions. So Patricio Figueroa asks, are there pieces of theater that can tell Taiwanese stories?
Okay. You mean there are actually quite a lot of theatrical productions in Taiwan about the so-called Taiwanese stories. And here I just give you one example. I mean, Wu Nianzhen, and this is really an old pro, a famous essayist and a script movie and the stage play script writer. He has directed a series and produced a series of theatrical works titled "人间孤儿," the orphans in the human conditions in the human world. I think lot of things can be discovered along this line, but probably I shouldn't talk too much in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Edward Painter is asking, to what extent authors from Southeast Asia are included in the Taiwan story? Of course, you already gave the example of Zhang Guixing, but I'm wondering if you want to say a little more about that.
I appreciate this question very much. I think this is a point of a controversy in Taiwan, actually, because some critics and the readers have always pointed fingers at these so-called Taiwanese and Malaysian writers, or Chinese and Malaysian writers, who have been living in Taiwan for so many years, but are still insisting on writing stories about their hometown region. So these writers, including Zhang Guixing and Kim Chiu-eun, always feel being sort of alienated from the literary community in Taiwan. They've always been sort of lumped together as so-called Mahua Zuojia, right, the Chinese and Malaysian writers. But there is a younger generation of Chinese and Malaysian writers now residing in Taiwan, who try to write about the more up-to-date circumstances in the Chinese and Malaysian community back to their home country, Malaysia, and also in Taiwan. So I don't know. For the generation of Zhang Guixing and Huang Jinshu, they simply feel they'll just have to keep telling their stories from their Bornean or Malaysian perspective. And they insist this Bornean perspective or Malaysian perspectives are part of the Taiwan stories, if really we're thinking of Taiwan stories in plural terms. So the debate is still going on, but of course, this is a sort of relatively senior generations writers' perspectives. The younger writers, the younger generation may have a different take on this, but still, I would still say they are being classified as a specific category. And we'll have to wait and see whether they would really eventually be welcome to join this bigger family called the Taiwan Stories and the community of Taiwan Stories. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And for our final question, I think this is a great way to end our conversation. This is from Yen Zhang, and she asks, Professor Wang, my question is, what is your favorite good story or good stories that are told or should be told, whether they're Chinese or Taiwanese? And I'll just add that I think throughout this talk, when we started with Xi Jinping's imperative of tell the good Chinese story, that's been a political imperative, but maybe we can shift it to an aesthetic imperative, and you can share with it, give us some spiritual sustenance to send us off with. What are some of the greatest storytellers coming out of Taiwan today?
Well, my immediate answer, very ironically, I would say, well, I've written a book about those great China stories in my mind. So I try very hard to sell those stories. I feel anybody who is studying contemporary and modern China should spare some time, take a look at those stories. I think the stories, I just actually grouped those stories in three categories: stories of, say, transgression, stories of transmigration, and stories of transillumination. So probably I shouldn't go into any of those categories today. On the Taiwan part, I believe I have yet to formulate my own sort of aesthetic sort of standard or political standard in making my final judgment. But basically, to answer this question, I would say that personally, I prefer more experimental works in terms of sort of a stylistic innovation, in terms of a kind of sort of intervention with any kind of extended paradigms and so on, and also kind of a retooling of familiar subject matters. Above all, I think a good Taiwan story still has to demonstrate a capacity of mastery of the language. This is a very subtle and perhaps even sensitive question, because at a time when quite a number of readers and the Taiwan identity sort of campaigners and promoters are suggesting that We couldn't care less about China. We want to really depart from the good old, or should I say, bad old legacies and so on and so forth. I mean, the challenge of a language is so very much urgent for us to think about whether we should further complicate the dialectic of our theory of what is Taiwan or what makes it Taiwan. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think for any good writer to become successful and popular, for any good reader of good Taiwan stories, to really appreciate the nuances of a good story, I think language still is very, very important. In this case, I have to say 中文 or 华文, the Chinese language. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. And I'm just going to end with a confessional. And that is, I hesitated to invite Professor Wang because he's so busy and I just hate to take up his time. And I'm glad I got the courage to invite you. And I'm so glad you accepted and shared this new research with us. We really appreciate it. And I think all of our 100+ audience members send you a virtual applause. And
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to our audience. And again, go log on to the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies website. There's a mailing list you can add your name to get informed about upcoming events. We also have a YouTube channel where you can view videos of past events or today's event if you want to watch it again. And we hope to see you virtually again in our future events and hopefully one day back in person. So thanks again, Professor Wang. Thank you, Esther. And thank you to Taiwan Academy for helping sponsor this. Also to the Asia Pacific Center for co-sponsoring. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.